Hey everybody, Simon Dixon here. So, October the 7th is a very sensitive topic because most people believe what they were told of what October the 7th is. And it laid the justification for the genocide and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians that at the time of me recording this message is still happening right now. I wanted to make sure that you're working with correct information. So I watched a documentary and I read all the United Nations reports. And even though the United Nations report said there is plausible evidence for sexual violence on October the 7th, when you actually read the report, it says it's just based upon circumstantial evidence, i.e., the positioning of certain people. And we all know now that we got confirmation from the war chief of Israel that Hannibal Directive was initiated that led to the Israeli Defense Force using Apache helicopters and opening fire on the party in Israel that led to the death of many Israelis. Now, we know that anybody that studied the history of intelligence operations knows that atrocity propaganda is a technique that is used frequently in order to justify the profits of the military industrial complex and settler colonialism, conquest of land. And obviously, the more atrocity, the easier it is to use the emotion in order to justify crimes against humanity. And so, what I wanted to make sure is that everybody at least had an understanding where all of the claims that were made on October the 7th around systemic sexual violence and everything that happened that was the justification did in fact just came from very compromised people within Israel. And although they will tell you that there's GoPro videos of everything, if you actually watch any of those videos, you'll find out that there is zero evidence of most of the claims that they actually make around mass sexual violence and many of the atrocity propaganda that was spread. So I know this is a very controversial subject. It leads to claims of being anti-Semitic. For those of you that know me, you know that my mother is Jewish. My father was Christian. And, so the claims are just weaponized in order to stop the truth. But without truth, there can be no peace. And right now, we are discovering the massive amount of lies that have been told to us to justify war and make profits for military companies when you follow the money. We know that 9/11 wasn't as 9/11 was told. And we know that right now, they're closing an investigation into the Jeffrey Epstein files because of all the bankers and authorities and government officials and various intelligence agencies, because these were intelligence operations. So we know the types of things that governments are willing to engage in. So what I wanted to do is just quickly give you a quick summary of a documentary that I watched that I thought was the best journalistic piece of work done by a Jewish person called Max Blumenthal, that went through and did all the work in terms of tracing back with very specific where all the allegations came from, how they got to the White House, and the documentaries that were made as a result of that in order to justify the ethnic cleansing and genocidal actions that were taken afterwards. Because without truth, there can be no peace. And so I've given a bit of an AI summary. And once you've listened to the AI summary, you can either stop there or you're welcome to actually go deep into all the evidence and all the citations and the exact specific names of everybody that was involved in making you believe that October the 7th was something very different to what it actually is. So suspend your disbelief. I think we're all at a point right now where we know that governments and intelligence and psychological operations and atrocity propaganda is used through operations like Operation Mockingbird, where the intelligence like CIA and Mossad have control over media, and Operation Gladio, where terrorist groups are funded by the West through USAID, like ISIS and Al Qaeda, in order to achieve Western government goals and then weaponize religion. And so this is my little introduction. I think it's a really important thing for you to understand, because once you know how these operations work, it's so much easier to decipher truth and not be fooled into fruitless, futile types of anger and hate. And we can all channel our anger in the right direction, which is towards the perpetrators of misinformation, lies, and deceit, in order to steal money, create inflation, print money, and do things like the big beautiful bill right now, where essentially they're taking a $1.3 trillion stimulus and then they're sending them to military contractors. And they need you to believe that that's justified. As they steal money, they get the money, you pay the inflation, and it's theft from the average person. And that's why they do these things like atrocity propaganda, in order to make you feel like their actions are justified. And we have witnessed right now the severe crimes against humanity that have been perpetuated as a result of this narrative that was shared and still continues to be shared on October the 7th, that was based upon complete false information and atrocity propaganda. So check out the AI summary. And if you want to go really deep, then I've written a blog overview, and you can listen. You can watch the full documentary, which I recommend everyone to do. But sometimes I know you're busy.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to unpack complex information, helping you get truly well-informed. Today, we're diving into a really sensitive and crucial topic, the events of October 7th, 2023. And specifically, the narratives that emerge very quickly afterwards, focusing on claims of what the sources are calling atrocity propaganda. That's the deliberate use of exaggerated, maybe even fabricated stories of horrific acts, usually to manipulate public opinion, often to dehumanize an enemy. Our sources for this deep dive are Simon Dixon's introduction and his blog, which relate to the documentary Atrocity, Inc. by Max Blumenthal.
And our mission here is really to explore how information can be shaped, how it's disseminated. We'll be scrutinizing some widely circulated claims by looking at what was later reported, or sometimes even contradicted, by official sources. And this raises a big question for you, the listener. How do we actually discern truth when information itself is weaponized?
Okay, let's unpack this then. Immediately after October 7th, these widespread, pretty shocking claims started circulating everywhere. We all heard reports like 40 beheaded babies, claims of mass sexual violence. What do the sources say about, where these specific claims started?
Well, it's crucial to trace the origin. And the sources suggest a pattern. That 40 beheaded baby story, for example, it was first broadcast by an Israeli channel, I-24. Their American correspondent cited just one source, a single Israeli soldier, David Zion. And he wasn't just a soldier, he was also a political leader of an illegal settlement group, one known for inciting violence.
Wow. Okay, and then these claims just exploded, right? Mainstream media, CNN, CBS, even President Biden repeated them. But here's where the sources say it gets really interesting. These specific claims, they were later walked back and retracted by the Israeli army itself, their government press office. As you mentioned, even the Biden White House walked them back. What about other sensational stories that the sources find more?
Oh, absolutely. The narrative didn't just stop there. Other really lurid stories emerged, amplified by figures like Yossi Landau from the Zaka organization, that's an Israeli volunteer rescue group. The sources note Landau, well, he lacked forensic credentials, but openly admitted using his imagination to describe torture scenes, things like children burned to death.
And the financial angle here, what did the sources uncover about that? Because Zaka was reportedly almost broke before October 7th, right?
That's right. And then donations just skyrocketed. Over $13 million came in very quickly. There were even reports, pretty disturbing ones, that Zaka volunteers might have rearranged corpses to exaggerate the horror, for potential donors.
Did it?
And another story that circulated widely but was debunked involved a baby baked in an oven, a claim the sources say seems specifically designed to evoke the Holocaust, really contributing to dehumanizing the adversary.
So these stories shaped perception, but the sources also point to issues with the basic numbers, right? The casualty figures.
Exactly. Initially, it was reported as 1,400 deaths. That number was later officially revised down to 1,200. And confirmations came out that hundreds included in that initial count were actually uniformed Israeli soldiers. And also Palestinians, fighters, and average citizens, too, caught up in the initial count.
And the sources bring up something called the Hannibal Directive, a controversial military procedure.
Yes, very controversial. It was once secret. It basically authorizes the Israeli army to kill not just captors, but their own soldiers, their own civilians, to prevent them from being taken hostage. There are accounts, including one from a survivor at Kibbutz Be'eri, describing an Israeli tank shelling a home.
A home filled with Israeli civilians held captive.
Yes, killing 12-year-old twins in that instance. Israeli media and officials have, since then, actually admitted to enacting this directive.
That adds a whole other layer to understanding the initial reports and how the narrative shifted.
Definitely. And as international support for Israel's military response started to, dwindle, the sources show a new narrative taking center stage, this time focusing on systemic rape by Hamas. The pollster Frank Luntz heavily influenced this, apparently finding that stories of raped civilians caused the most outrage. And you saw high-profile figures like Sheryl Sandberg, Hillary Clinton, championing this narrative. The sources even mentioned the use of what they term crisis actors in some promotions.
Right, and major outlets like the New York Times ran with these stories, based on sources like Yossi Landau again and anonymous accounts. But these were later contradicted.
Widely contradicted, yeah. By official kibbutz spokesmen, by a lack of forensic evidence from police investigations. Even the family of Gal Abdush, her story was used as a symbol of these horrors. They publicly denied she was raped. They said the timeline just made it impossible.
Wow.
And the sources even state Sheryl Sandberg's documentary used what they call violently coerced false confessions from Palestinian prisoners.
So connecting this, there's another side the sources bring up, about the Israeli prison system.
Yes, an Israeli human rights group, B'Tselem, reported on how the prison system transformed after October 7th, calling them de facto torture camps. They cite testimonies, even video evidence, of gang rape of Palestinian men by Israeli soldiers.
Video evidence.
Correct. And what the sources find particularly striking is that soldiers charged with these crimes received public support in Israel. Calls for their exoneration. It suggests that some allegations made against Palestinians were, in a way, maybe an exposed confession of actions by parts of the Israeli military itself.
So tying us all together, what does this mean for the media's role in all this?
Well, the sources argue pretty strongly that Western mainstream media's coverage, described as deceptive, had real-world consequences for Palestinians, contributing to a narrative that sometimes branded them as human animals.
And there's that quote from a military contractor CEO.
Right, saying this intellectual battle is critical, because if we lose the intellectual debate, you will not be able to deploy any army in the West, ever. It highlights the stakes involved in controlling the narrative.
Okay, so this deep dive really reveals a stark contrast, doesn't it, between those initial widely shared narratives and what later came out, often contradicting the early reports. It just underscores the power of information in shaping how we all see things, and, tragically, how it can be used to justify actions with devastating results.
Absolutely. The prevalence of what these sources call atrocity propaganda, the sheer speed with which narratives form, spread, and then are sometimes questioned, it really raises an important question for you listening now. How might understanding this process change your approach to consuming news, especially during conflicts? And maybe, what responsibility do we all share in trying to seek out the full, complex, often difficult truth? Something to think about.